Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and today I'm going to talk about Codevein's second build, or I should say second blood version of Codevein. And I just wanted to say that that version of the game is really amazing. I really like the changes they've brought into it, and I really like the new attack animations and all that stuff. But I've been watching Dark Souls recently, and it convinced me to go back to Dark Souls after a few months. And finally, I've been noticing that Dark Souls has some things that Codevein still don't have even in the second build of it, and that is an important factor, which is the enemy's behavior in combat. So in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the combat behavior of the enemies in Codevein, and I'll compare it a bit with Dark Souls, but I'm also going to talk about the dungeons in Codevein, and I'm not talking about the environments here, but some stuff that are lacking in the dungeons of Codevein, and I'm not going to compare that to Dark Souls at all, in fact. So let's start with the enemy behavior in Codevein. Generally, enemy behavior is defined by various type of aspects, but in the Souls-like genre it's more defined by a few more stuff than the other games. Now I understand that the enemies we've seen so far in Codevein are most likely early game enemies, but generally enemy behavior is a thing that should be included for every sort of enemy, either if they are from end game or early game, and that's the same case in Dark Souls. They just need to be distributed in different ways. So for example, we have stuff like the detection radius, which is the radius within which the enemy will be able to detect the player or notice the player, and then they will decide to attack. From what I've seen in Codevein so far, the enemy detection radius is really small, and not only that it's very small, but also as soon as they detect the player, the first thing they do is that they scream at the player for 3 seconds. So I don't think that's a really good stuff for them. It's not a really good idea. They get exposed to attacks very easily. The next thing is about the attack radius, and that is not a hitbox. The attack radius is the radius within which the enemy would decide to attack the player. In Dark Souls, it's a really important aspect because the enemies in Dark Souls generally tend to attack the player at their maximum range, not at the minimum range. In Codevein, enemies tend to attack the player at a minimum range, and minimum range is when the player is basically in their face. So even though they have a weapon that has a lot of reach or a really big hitbox, the enemies will attack the player at the minimum range, and they will not be able to exploit the hitbox of their weapon. So that's another minus for Codevein, and I feel like they should change that as well. The next thing I want to talk about is a little bit specific to some enemies, and that is something that I like to call lock-on tracking. That is a behavior that allows the enemy to focus on the player and target them, and also follow the movement of the player at all times. Generally in Dark Souls, it's given to enemies with shields so that they cannot give their backs to the player easily. It will be a good mechanic, it will be a good behavior for enemies in Codevein as well, even though they do not block necessarily. I think it's a good behavior for enemies that have generally weapons like halberds or spears, so that the player really has a difficult time to get in their backs or really find an opening for them to attack. Next, we also have tracking attacks. Now this one is a little bit tricky, and it can change with enemies. It's not really so specific to some of them, it's more specific to a type of attacks. So tracking attacks are attacks that have the ability to kind of follow the player a tiny bit, not necessarily too much, but they really follow the player. A good example of that are charging attacks, or I should say attacks that can rush the player. For example, when the enemy is running at the player with an attack, that is the kind of attack that I'm talking about. And generally they tend to have a really good tracking of the player movement, so that the player cannot dodge, and they really have to time their rolling so that they can avoid the attack at a very specific moment. It's also used a lot for vertical swings, but not that much. It's there, but not as much as the charging attacks. But it's also really present for thrusting attacks. For example, enemies that use tabs attack or stuff like that, they will tend to have a really good tracking on those attacks, so that the player cannot just dodge them by walking around. Now in Dark Souls, in order to balance things a little bit more, enemies with lock-on tracking generally have bad tracking attacks, or sometimes they also have bad recovery frames. And that leads me to the next thing that I want to talk about, which are the animation attacks, or the attack animation I should say. For the attack animations, generally they have 3 types of frames in them. The first type is the startup frames, and the startup frames are frames where the attack is being prepared. Sometimes they can be slow or they can be also really fast as well. The next type of frame is the active frames, which are the frames where the hitbox and the attack kick in. Finally, we got recovery frames, which are the frames where the enemy will return to its idle stance. Those are also important frames as they can really make an enemy really fast or really slow, and they also define the frequency of attacks of an enemy. If the recovery frames are really fast, in general it means that the enemy will be able to attack at a much higher rate. They will attack a lot more than enemies with long recovery frames. Now, in addition to all of this, you also have things like the moveset and the different hitboxes of the moves, but that's pretty much it for the enemy behavior. And generally, enemies in Dark Souls tend to have these type of traits differently. So something that I would like to see, at least in codevein, even though the enemies we have seen so far are early game enemies, is at least the attack radius. That is really an important factor that every enemy should have in codevein. The ability to attack with maximum radius means that they are able to anticipate the player's move, and they also force the player to be more cautious about their approach to the enemies. And I think that's something codevein greatly lacks even in the second build. Aside of that, another thing that I've noticed is the fact that hit stun animations are really a little bit too long. From what I've seen so far in codevein, it seems like they wanted the enemies to be able to get stunned or staggered by attacks, especially from the one-hit sword, staggered by those attacks every 2 hits. But the problem is the animation is too long, the hits animations are too long, and because of that, the enemies don't get really, they get staggered a lot longer than they are supposed to be, and cause them to be able to get stun lock. So like I said, enemy behavior is really an important thing, but we should not forget that we want to play codevein, we don't want to play Dark Souls, and it's important for the game to stand out a little bit. So I got some, little concepts that I would like to, see in the game, and those concepts are clearly not impossible. I always like to give something that is within the range of the developers and stuff like that. So let's see what I can do here. So the first thing I wanted to see is enemies that can use more gifts. Of course, there are some enemies that are able to use some gifts, but those are gifts that are more, the combat type of gifts instead of buffs. Because the thing in codevein is that shields don't exist. In Dark Souls, the enemies have shields, they can tank, they can do shit. But in codevein, enemies don't have shields. And something that would be good and something that can slightly increase the difficulty of the game, really slightly but not too much, is if the enemies with rifles could be able to use the same gifts as a player. That will increase the defense. Of course, it does have to apply to every enemy in the map. It can apply to enemies within a certain radius as well. So enemies with rifles can play the role of supports a little bit and buff the other enemies around them. And something that is really interesting that I've really seen in codevein that is really nice is the fact that generally enemies with the rifles can be reached by using shortcuts. They are generally exposed when you use shortcuts, and you can find them really easily, so that when the player uses a shortcut, they'll be able to take down that enemy before they are able to use a gift to buff enemies around them. So that's a way to also force the player to explore the map a little bit more instead of rushing it. And it's also a good thing for the mini boss in the cave, because if by accident the player ever starts to engage a fight with the mini boss without taking out enemies around, the mini boss will be able to get some buffs. So I think it will be kind of a good thing for the enemies with the rifle to be able to use that type of gift so that they can buff the others. And that, in my opinion, is much better than having them screaming at the player for 3 seconds when they notice them. So next I want to talk about the blood veils a little bit, and I'm not asking for them to add more to the blood veils than they already did. In fact, the blood veils are alright. I want to talk about the enemy's perspective of the blood veils, and something that I would like to see. In fact, I said it in my Ren video, and I wanted to see enemies that can become resistant to basic attacks so that they can be exposed to blood veils attacks only, or maybe gift attacks as well. In fact, I would like to see enemies that will enter that kind of state when they reach 50% health maybe. That's something that would be interesting in my opinion. And it also gives a purpose to the blood veils as well, and it rewards the player for using blood veils too. And speaking of blood veils, I think it would be really nice to also have enemies that can use blood veils, and not only that can use blood veils, but that have their body modified by the blood veils as well. It's kind of a little bit weird here, but I had that idea after looking at the Susanoo in God Eater. And the Susanoo seems it's a kind of scorpion. I would say a scorpion, but it has a stinger type blood veil on its back, but it also has the ability to attack the player with its defenses. I guess I say its harms, and that kind of looks like the hound type blood veil to me. So it's kind of a combination of the two of them. But I'm not saying that I want a Susanoo in codevein, but I'd like to have this type of enemy. And I've seen a lot of people that have been asking if the game will have different types of enemy instead of just humanoids, enemies that are like humans, like say. So yeah, I like to see that type of stuff as well. But enemies, yeah, that can use blood veils too, because they were revenants. So this is all I wanted to talk about for the enemies. So let's talk about the dungeons now. And like I said, I'm not talking about anything like the environment or stuff like that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the sense of exploration, I would say. So the dungeons in codevein are so far they're very narrow, they're very linear, and they also lack of verticality from what I've seen so far. And in my opinion, I feel like the dungeons, they really need more space into them. What I mean by that is that I think they need to add more space for the player to be able to fight the enemies better. They need more distance for the player to travel as well, because the dungeon, they kind of feel a little bit small. And I understand that they might want the players to be more cautious about jumping off a cliff or maybe running into a wall of fire, stuff like that. But the way the dungeons are right now, they are way too restrictive for the player's movement, but also for the enemy's movement and their detection. Like I said, the detection range in codevein for the enemies is really small. The player almost have to be in their face, because every part of the dungeons in codevein are just so close to each other that they have to limit the radius of the detection so that the player will not feel like they are being constantly ambushed. Next, there's an issue with the verticality, and the verticality is also an important factor because it's a way to reveal the location of secrets and some enemies, but sometimes it's also a way to reveal the objective and to guide the player. Now, it's somewhat difficult to add verticality because there is no sort of elevator. It does have hills and ladders sometimes, but I feel like ladders are a little bit out of place, especially in this context. So I thought of some concepts that they can use instead of having ladders or elevators. For example, let's start with the elevators. I thought of something like the mistles, but a weaker version of the mistles, because as we know, the mistles are used by the revenants as a way to travel from a location to another one. So I thought of a concept of a weak mistle that would only be used as an elevator. Of course, I think it needs a point A and a point B to be used, and both of them should be activated. It's also a way for them to add shortcuts, vertical shortcuts to the boss fight instead of having a missile next to a boss fight. So I thought that would be a good idea. And in terms of animation, I thought it would be nice if it would make the character turn into particles and slowly flies towards the other weak missiles above or below. And I had that idea after seeing the second build of the game, when at the start of it, where the player character kind of reformed its own body with a lot of particle effects. It's a really cool animation, and I thought they could use the same type of animation for a weak missile. So it would be kind of like an elevator. Of course, it should be kind of a slow animation so that the player has trouble to use it in the middle of a fight. But that's pretty much all I would say for the elevators. There's really not much they can do with that. Now let's talk about the ladders. I thought they were kind of a little bit out of place because you don't have ladders hanging here and there in the city. So I thought it would be better if they could replace ladders by some sort of high jump that could be slow to use. I guess it'd be more stylized and be more suiting to the vampire theme. of course, in both of these concepts, it would be important for a player to be able to get hit or to be able to die during those animations. But I feel like it's also a good way for them to protect clumsy players that will press, I don't know, B by accident and then rolling and jumping off an elevator and die that stupid way. That can be kind of frustrating in Dark Souls. So in codevein be a good way to protect the player from that kind of thing. But yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. That's pretty much all I can talk about. Like I said, the second build is really amazing, but if they could just fix the enemies a little bit, and the dungeon, the whole dungeon point that I have, it's kind of it's not really too important to me. It's not much of an issue actually. I play the game without having any issue for the dungeon, but at least I want the enemies to feel like a threat. I want them to be a little bit more challenging, but not too ridiculous at the same time. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. If you did not, or I wasn't clear, then let me know of that in the comment. But yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. So I'll see you all next time.